We've already heard the Indiana story from Mike and the secretary. So we're now going to take a little bit of a look through a UK lens. So we're going to look, sorry, I'm also not very tall. We're now going to look through a UK lens at how the opportunities in this ecosystem look to an entrepreneur invested in a UK journey. So I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Renos Savva, Head of Innovation and Venture Development at Discovery Park, and Nara Daubeney, CEO and co-founder of Phaim Pharma, to discuss the UK's positioning on a global stage. So over to you both. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we've got not quite the graveyard shift, but nearly.
Yeah, we're going to be using the F word a lot, aren't we?
Fun.
Failure.
Thought you were going to say
It's
something
okay,
else.
everybody. We'll succeed later when they start pouring the drinks.
So thank you so much for those of you who've stayed. We're going to try and make this a little bit interactive and hopefully informative as well. So Renos and I know each other for a little time, but there's lots of things I don't know about you, Renos. And despite the boyish, youthful looks, you've been doing this for quite some time.
Yes, indeed.
So tell us a little bit about your journey, what has or hasn't worked for you, and what you're doing now to try and encourage this space.
Thank you. So I'll tell it how it was.
Okay.
And then Nara will tell us how it is. I think let's start with today. Let's start with the fact that I went to the Genesis drinks last night and people were talking about the COVID pandemic and lockdown. And I think it's astonishing people are still talking about that. Other popular topics yesterday evening were Brexit. I find it interesting that people are still talking about that. So I'm going to see them and raise them and talk about the dot-com bust. How about it, kids? Anybody remember that? Yes, it places me somewhere in my 80s at the time, long after I founded Eli Lilly Company. What I did found was a company called DomainX. At the turn of the century, I'm allowed to say that I'm that old. And it started in a university department. And everybody was saying, oh, you know, why are you bothering? You know, in those days, it was all about becoming an academic. And it was a failure as an academic to become a founder. Lots of F words for you. Sorry, it's late. What did I experience? Well, first of all, I experienced that as somebody who'd never done entrepreneurship before, there was a lot to learn. Thankfully, there were a lot of seasoned entrepreneurs and people from pharma who believed that startup was the next big thing, who were willing to help. These days, you have accelerators by the dozen, and you still have excellent people giving it back. Another thing I found was that if you were young in the old days, they gave you awards like Young Entrepreneur of the Year, and then they pulled that lever from the Graham Norton show and you disappeared down a hole, never to be seen again. That was a good one. When I got to the surface, it was about Brexit, I think. Anyway, but what was happening? The dot-com bust had made people's appetites very meager for investment. Anybody recognize any parallels with what we've been hearing today? Things are cyclical, right?
Yeah.
The other thing we found was that technology transfer was perhaps in its infancy. We heard today that it's quite mature, and I'm really glad to see that and to agree with that statement. And if it wasn't for the tech transfer offices and if it wasn't for those people giving it back, I wouldn't be here today because I wouldn't know a damn thing. Sorry, I used a D word. I should have used an F word, but it's not late enough. So, what happens? I started a startup in London at a university. I think startups can happen anywhere. It was interesting to hear the US story and to hear lately about Indiana. Not many people think about Indiana. We've all heard of Boston and we all think about the West Coast, but it's really refreshing because I think in the UK, we're rather smaller than that scale of geography, and yet we tend to over-regionalize ourselves. At the moment, I work at a site which is in East Kent, which Pfizer chose 70 years ago this year. And there's a lot of built infrastructure. We hear about a lot of building going on in London. London suits some people, but I've met a lot of people in even the last couple of years who say, I want to get out of London. I never grew up in a city. I don't like this. And so I think we've got a little bit of everything, and we should be glad about that. And then the other thing I realized is that getting funded and getting contracts is about knowing people. And again, this came through the program today. I think it's by those human conversations, and boy, am I glad I don't talk about the pandemic anymore, because I'm fed up of camera calls. I still do a lot of them, but thankfully we've simmered down a little bit. So I'd say all in all, what's missing from the UK PLC's CV is there's just not enough talk about failure, I'm afraid, because I'm afraid I succeeded with Domain X. I have failed, and if you buy me enough drinks later, I might tell you. But we don't like to talk about it here. We certainly don't like to brag about it. So Nara, you're no failure. Tell me, what's it like these days?
So we'll come back to the failure question. So a little bit of a background about myself. So Phaim is stands for the AIM, and Phaim rather stands for antigenic immune modulation, and we do novel therapies for autoimmune disease. It's really come around an idea that was just that. It started as an idea. So if you're sticking to my topics, if you're a UK entrepreneur and you want to think, why should I, to some degree, commit myself to the UK when you've got brilliant people like David from Indiana going, where our CapEx has gained and raised from 3 billion to just under 40 billion in 3 years. You know, that's something else. So there's really 5 things you need to thrive as an entrepreneur. Obviously, you need good science, which, of course, if you're leaning into that company you think you have. Software, which is people. Hardware, great places to make it happen. The environment in which to do it. And then money. So that's really what you need, and you need those in different degrees at different times to make that happen. So how does the UK PLC stack up to that? And things are feeling a bit sticky. I think there isn't anybody who says, yeah, 2023, 24, that was a breeze. That was really some good years. So the things that really we need to think about or work on is some points about how do we communicate the science. I think for UK PLC, the people are brilliant. We've got leading universities that will punch well above their weight and come to the top of the line, you know, on worldwide stage. The place is an interesting, so the hardware is an interesting point. So I think that's worth spending some time on. And there's lots of spaces, obviously, within the Golden Triangle. But one of the interesting things, and probably this is why we're on this panel, is because in some ways Discovery Park is an entrepreneur in its own right as a thing, because you're going out there and pitching yourselves. And I've been there, and it's a fantastic place. So I think we need more of that. We need more Discovery Parks. We need, I'm going to probably blaspheme by saying that we have to look outside of the Golden Triangle and think about places that
no money was exchanged.
that's 40 minutes from London and can do that. So I think that's really very important. But we've got to say not the F word but the M word, which is money. And the whole thing that fuels the engine, hires people, goes out and signs contracts and manufactures and pays CROs and pays for lab space is funding. And then funding goes to my last point, which is, of course, the environment that we're in. And to channel my inner Bill Clinton, is the economy stupid? So if we've got really, really high interest rates, unfortunately, that's going to percolate through into the appetite for investment. So it's quite unique to be sitting here as the entrepreneur saying, what do I want? Because normally it's the other place, and you have to say you're the one that's sort of doing a lot of the asking. And people doing a lot of the telling to you. I kind of compare it to think being an entrepreneur is like being a pregnant woman. You're never short of unsolicited advice, some of which is useful and some of which is more generic. So I think those are the things that are really, really important, relevant, and the UK is a brilliant place for places and people, but we are just one place amongst the Indianas, the Jerseys, never mind the Bostons, the San Franciscos, India, Australia, etc.
Australia.
Australia.
Is that where you're doing a clinical trial by any chance?
Yes, so we are. We are indeed. And that, to some of the regulatory points, is one of the things that has been a little bit difficult this year, particularly is around the MHRA, the speed and the expertise and the way that percolates through. So I think there's people pitching for the general brilliance of the UK entrepreneur landscape to come to them. And that's very wide ranging.
Well, I'd like to echo George Freeman from this morning to say I think the UK is a brilliant place to do science, and we just need to tune ourselves into what's going on. So I know it's last year's news, but there was a bit of a day at the races in investment after this pandemic era. And I think there was a lot of superheating in terms of what was invested. The valuations were a bit crazy. And I think macroeconomics joining forces with that is a perfect storm. But let's not forget there is plenty in there. And to come back to one of those earlier points, we need to make sure there's money down there at that base level for those green shoots to come through. What's your own experience of getting that kind of initial seed corn and into pre-seed and seed?
Yeah, so I think one of the really interesting things, and everybody who's ever tried to raise money will hopefully agree with this, is the agility and flexibility that you have to have as a founder. And, you know, CEO really just stands for Chief Everything Officer, from making the tea and taking the bins out, as well as, you know, going out there and pitching and bringing the funding in. But it's actually trying to not just find your tribe, but find people for whom your proposal works. Because the nature of particularly life sciences and biotech investing and entrepreneurship, but it's true for everything, it is high risk. It's those are firecracker stuff. You know, you light it, and if it shoots out of the sky, then it's breathtakingly beautiful, but it could just go and nothing happens. And so one of the things that we have to be very good at communicating, and to the what's in the desired shopping list would be very good to have back, is that ability to not just put up with, but seek out failure, and seek out not just risk, not unmitigated risk, but calculated risk, and be really happy around the blurred edges of going, actually, this is early. We don't know everything. I can tell you what it does in this particular mouse model or that particular thing. But truthfully, I don't know 100% what will happen if you do X, Y, and Z. So it's really sort of loving the questions that comes out of.
Let's look at failure rates right up at the top end at 2B and phase 3, right?
Yeah.
So they're great, aren't they, for failure?
Yeah.
So why should we be so afraid down at the bottom, right? So is generative AI going to help us there? Are we going to become professionally risk averse?
Right. So that's a very interesting question, because, and this is a personal lens, I suspect whenever you're thinking of investing in company or companies, you're playing a risk game, and you're playing a risk mitigation game. And typically the things that one would look for, although I think I'm very aware that there's an investor meeting after hours, and they can probably comment on this a lot better than I can, but one is looking for risks and mitigation of risks, and what does success look like, and how is it mirrored from things that have gone past. And there are certain things to that, and one of them is actually a serial exiter entrepreneur. But it's not actually my statistics, but a lot of the serial exiter entrepreneurs in the UK who've done it before are from the same pool of people, which means that you haven't got the new entrants coming in who've fallen flat on their face and dusted themselves off and picked themselves up again. And if you don't have that feed through, then you end up having brilliant people, but a very, very small pool.
So are you saying other CVs, and let us hypothesize this might include Boston in the United States, have got people who know what it's like to eat dirt?
A little bit, and a lot of people who've done it and have done that flat on their face then go into other bits of the ecosystem. So it's, again, preaching to the choir, but a lot of other places like Boston, for example, and I say this as my background for those who don't know, I'm actually a surgeon, and as an aside, I run the innovation pathway here at the Royal Society of Medicine, is that pretty much all medics and academics as well have a side hustle. They're all NEDs, they're all to some degree directors, they will always have something else. And that rich cross-pollination works. To your point about an academic then going out and doing something, we still don't do that very much. And so you've got this amazing pool of talent and knowledge and medical expertise that then doesn't see the light of day, because there isn't that pulling out of, because it's the NHS, that's the primary provider of healthcare, into private enterprise and then back again. And someone was saying on the earlier panels, people looking to put it back into the NHS, and actually the NHS is not a place to necessarily innovate afresh, to try a new thing out, or to be an early adapter. It does not do that. It does it very, very far down the line. And it looks at sort of amazing patient data. But actually, for anyone who's ever done anything with NHS data, it's disparate, it's messy, it's very rich, but very, very difficult to get anything from. Palantir, obviously, is going to sort of change that narrative. So we've got great, great things that don't necessarily connect up. And innovation and private enterprise is the thing that drives the engine that just makes those crosslinks and connections. And
So
we need to...
let's go back to that narrow pool of success stories in the UK PLC CV. And the fact that I myself support entrepreneurs through programs, and these programs are basically, you've got your idea, you're very clever, we're very happy about that, but what do you know about business? So we bring a lot of people to the party to try and let them know. People I encounter quite frequently are nurses, either in the NHS or who left the NHS because they're frustrated that they're not the right kind of people and nobody takes them seriously, even inside the NHS Clinical Entrepreneurship Program. So how do we change that?
Oh, gosh. You're right. I think by creating an environment where not just accelerators, which are relatively difficult to get into, but having places where that communication can happen. So one of the bits around the RSMs trying to do is do exactly that. I'll give you an example. So anybody who's been in Boston knows you've got Team Mass. There's a whole group of them. It doesn't matter whose door you knock on, they will get you to the right people. So it's having these senses of innovation and engine driving.
Does it matter who you are?
Depends on to whom. It shouldn't matter. But
so you were talking to the NHS being hard to get into, but also the NHS is quite structured in a very vertical way.
Yeah,
and
you will very often see some incredibly bright and some of the brightest, ablest people who come out and do fantastically well, as in stellar stuff outside of the NHS, are not doctors. There will be nurses, physios,
but outside
of the NHS.
So what are we doing here with UK PLC CV? Are we saying that the NHS is something that you should aspire to get into later on, but you need to prove yourself in the private markets first?
I think private markets drive the engine. That's undoubtedly true. The cross-pollination we need to get better at, because there's absolute brilliance, but how we bring that out is really important, and it has to be fluid, it has to be ongoing, and it has to somehow, just listening to that Indiana panel, you all of a sudden thought, I think I can, sounds like somewhere I'd like to be, So I think we need to sort of, the humility I think you have to have as a founder, because you're always self-reflecting, questioning yourself to some degree. We should have that with the bravery about UK PLC, because it's brilliant. It's a brilliant place to be, with brilliant people, talent, financial services, and all of those things. But I think we're probably, I hate to be a pessimist, but probably going to have some choppy waters if interest rates go up, I would suggest.
So we've got about 30 seconds each to say something really upbeat for the people here. Shall I go first?
Go ahead, yeah.
I think there's entrepreneurs by the truckload in this country. I think there are excellent schemes in this country to help those people out. And I think what we've heard today earlier, and what we're trying to condense here in this panel, is that there are still gaps. So if you're feeling innovative and you think you know the right people, why don't we get together and plug those gaps? Because our CV looks great. It just needs reformatting.
Yeah, that's it. Left indent. And on that note, I think the thing that makes brilliant things happen is people, 100%. We've got great science, that's a given. As with everything, it's the people that make things happen at each of those levels. So I think it's a good shape. We'll be all right.
Thank you, Nara.
Thank you very much, Renos. Thank you.